بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا صدق الله العلي العظيم.
The Afghan Taliban are an enigma that the world still can't get its head around. A fundamentalist movement that ended up surviving the greatest military coalition the world had seen since the Second World War. In this video, we shall look into the evolution of the Taliban up until the fall of Kabul in 2021. The Taliban traced their beginnings to the Soviet war in Afghanistan. It is widely understood that they participated in the Mujahideen militias. However, in hindsight, though members of the likes of Mullah Omar participated in the war, their actual impact was not consequential. The true rise of the Taliban can be observed in the aftermath of the Soviet war, specifically in the countless refugee camps scattered all over the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. The withdrawal of the Soviet forces and the subsequent fall of the government plunged the country into a state of chaos. The former Mujahideen commanders fractured the country into fiefdoms and fought over influence and control. This period, most commonly known as the warlord era, took a high toll on the populace at large and thus created a vacuum for a national movement to steer the country out of the mess it had found itself in. It needs to be noted here that the Taliban movement was not started by formerly educated Islamists from the Al-Azhar cadre that preceded the Taliban, rather by a minor village cleric in response to local injustices surrounding him. Interestingly, initially the reason to tear for the Taliban was reprimanding a corrupt local warlord. However, as the news spread of a Robin Hood-like figure and his band of students, the movement gained considerable momentum. It can be argued that the Taliban have evolved through 5 phases. The first being the formative phase from 1994 to 96, when in only 2 years the movement's numbers swelled to such a degree that they could challenge Kabul itself. Here it must be noted that most of these recruits were from the aforementioned refugee camps in Pakistan. The second phase per se started with the Taliban gaining power in Kabul and most of Afghanistan by 1996, to the eventual fall of the regime in 2001. These years saw the Taliban forming a government under the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and continued their efforts to suppress any remaining resistance in the country. It has to be appreciated that the Taliban's lack of expertise in statecraft was evident with a lack of recognition from the wider community of nations, albeit some countries did recognize the Taliban government, namely Pakistan, the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Further, years of civil war had stripped the landlocked country of the already bare infrastructure it possessed. Afghanistan lacked basic amenities like water, electricity, telecommunications, and logistical infrastructure was practically non-existent. Here it would also be advantageous to mention that the regime had given sanctuary to Saudi billionaire Osama bin Laden, who in the 80s had played a major role in providing financial and logistical support to the Mujahideen, and since had been disillusioned with the American interventions in the Middle East and formed a transnational terrorist organization, the Al-Qaeda, to combat the United States, and was also supporting the Taliban financially.
Came in like a missile, like a fireball missile across from the New York harbor side, I guess from the Newark direction. It came in like a spear. It just speared through the building like a fireball.
The horrific 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, carried out by the aforementioned Al-Qaeda, ushered in a third phase of the Taliban movement, so to speak. Even though the Taliban had given sanctuary to bin Laden, they did not foresee the attack or its implications on the regime. The initial response was that of outrage towards bin Laden at the blatant abuse of hospitality that the Taliban had provided. The senior Taliban leadership was divided on the matter. Most held the belief that any compromise with the United States would translate into capitulation. However, there were those who begged to differ and proposed to hand over bin Laden. The Taliban proposed the same solution they had advocated in 1998 in response to the African embassy bombings, that they would assess any evidence provided to them and ascertain if they would hand over bin Laden to another Islamic country for trial before a multinational Islamic court. This response clearly demonstrates the lack of foresight to how the USA might respond. The Taliban were convinced that the USA would only resort to a limited response. The USA, on the other hand, treated this as casus belli to initiate Operation Enduring Freedom. And the operation was launched on the 7th of October 2001. And by November of the same year, the Taliban were on a run. An interim government was established by virtue of the Bonn Agreement in December, effectively ending Taliban rule. In 2002, the Taliban regrouped and launched an insurgency against the NATO coalition and the new Afghan government. This insurgency started to pick up momentum after 2003 as a direct result of the new regime's inability to deliver and the gross alienation experienced by the Taliban and other segments of the society. The American strategy was aimed at accomplishing quick military objectives, which led it to partner with influential figures whose main goal was to capture the state apparatus for personal gain. Individuals, warlords, semi-warlords, all fought over influence. This in turn led to endemic corruption that haunted succeeding regimes as well. The Taliban launched a string of guerrilla attacks on the coalition forces, employing deadly tactics such as suicide attacks, and by 2006, they started regaining territory, specifically in the south of the country. It has to be noted here that these successes were also as a result of the American policy shift towards Iraq, which diverted much needed attention in Afghanistan. The fourth phase, which may be cited as ranging from 2007 to 2014, saw a continuation of the insurgency. Between 2009 and 2011, the coalition forces were forced to increase their numbers to a staggering 140,000 soldiers. Vis-a-vis the military engagements, attempts were also made for negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Under the Obama administration, several attempts led to no fruitful results. In 2015, similar attempts were made in coordination with Pakistan and China. However, these too bore no results. Even though the NATO operations ended and all security responsibilities were given to the Afghan government, the Taliban kept on gaining ground. And by the time the Trump administration took charge, the Taliban were running a parallel administration and in many areas out-administered the sitting government. It can be argued that the fifth phase of the Taliban movement began with the Trump administration. Interestingly, in 2018, Ashraf Ghani announced that his government was ready and willing to sit at the negotiating table with the Taliban, and he also recognized them as a legitimate political entity. However, the Taliban refused and maintained that the Afghan government was not legitimate, rather a foreign puppet. At this point, the Taliban saw the US as a counterpart, not Ashraf Ghani's government. In 2019, the American and Taliban delegates met in Doha, Qatar for peace talks for the first time. These lengthy negotiations lasted for a year, and by February 2020, a peace deal was signed between the Taliban and the USA. This deal amounted to an active ceasefire, which is only applicable to foreign troops.